Thank you, everyone. Now we would like to start the second session, Japan's contribution to G7 governance. I would also like to introduce the chair for this session, Tomoko Utsumi, Associate Professor, Soka University.
Thank you for joining us for this session titled Japan's Contribution to G7 Governance. My name is Tomoko Utsumi from Soka University, and I'll be chairing this session. So in the previous session, we heard about G7 contributions to global governance as a whole. And in this session, we are going to focus on Japan's role in G7 governance, as well as what G7 means to Japan. So we have two speakers in this session. Each speaker will have about 12 minutes for their presentations, and then we will open the floor for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions about the presentation, please wait until after both presentations are over. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Professor Hugo Dobson from the University of Sheffield.
Can everyone hear me? Marvelous. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank Tomoko for her introduction. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. And I'd like to thank the organisers of today's event. I would particularly like to congratulate Soka University on its performance in the Times Higher Education Top 100 Universities in Japan poll that came out 2 weeks ago. Clearly an institution with real global ambition. Very impressive to see. I'm particularly sort of grateful for the invitation to come back to Japan today to see old friends and to meet new ones. This is my first time back to Japan since December 2019. And in fact, I can remember I was sat in a hotel in Sendai because of the time difference. I was eating my breakfast while I was watching the election results come in from the UK. In what would prove to be Boris Johnson's landslide election victory. I'll be honest with you, I did consider whether I should actually go home to the UK at that point. My family, much to their relief, I did go back, but this is the first time to be back. 3 prime ministers later, both in the case of the UK and in Japan. It's good to be back. So thank you very much for that invitation. Now, the observant members of the audience will notice that we're talking here today about Japan's contribution to G7 governance, and yet none of the speakers are actually Japanese. I think an outsider's perspective is always helpful. Area studies is based on an outsider's perspective in many ways. But I think hopefully we'll be able to ensure that we get a louder Japanese voice in the Q&A that follows these presentations. Now, what I would like to do in my allotted time is begin to address 2 questions. First of all, how Japan matters to the G7, and then I'm going to flip the question around and talk a little bit about how the G7 matters to Japan in a variety of ways. And I'm going to take a historical perspective here. I'm going to look back across 48 summits between 1975 and 2022 to sort of tease out some of those aspects that answer those questions and suggest what we might expect of the 49th summit in Hiroshima. I'm also going to take a visual approach to this question. Now, this photo that I've got here is a photo that many of you will have seen. It's quite infamous. It's from the 2018 summit in Canada. It got a lot of attention at the time. It was obviously one moment that captured everyone's imagination. You know, the next following minute, it would have been all smiles and handshakes and everyone getting on nicely. But this was the image. Going back to the question about the role of the media in presenting the G7, this captures a sort of certain dynamic within the G7 that tapped into people's preconceptions around the leaders. And inevitably, the attention was focused on Trump and was focused on Merkel in that sort of confrontation across the table. But I think what got lost in the interpretation, the reaction to that image, was the position of the late Prime Minister Abe and his role as a sort of intermediary between the two. And that's certainly a theme I'll return to later on in teasing out how Japan has contributed to the G7. I think John mentioned this in his presentation, that the G7 can often be seen as a photo opportunity. But, you know, an image does paint 1,000 words and does matter in the optics of all this. So, first of all, my first question, how does Japan matter to the G7? A few aspects that highlight the way in which Japan has contributed towards the G7 over 48 summits since 1975. first of all, the agenda, the G7's agenda. Japan has shaped this agenda in a number of ways over the years. First of all, I think one way that Japan has managed to shape the G7's agenda is by giving Asia a voice within that agenda. Asian issues that might get overlooked otherwise have appeared on the G7's agenda. Going back to the 1970s and 80s with Cambodia, fast forwarding to East Timor, and North Korea has appeared regularly because of Japan going out and ensuring that these issues do appear on the summit's agenda. Now, I said this was going to be a visual presentation. I had a great fun going through Japanese newspapers and teasing out political cartoons that sort of capture some of these aspects. This is from the 1998 Birmingham Summit in the UK. And you can see here Tony Blair as host looking slightly bemused as the other G7 leaders huddle around the microphone trying to decide what's going to appear in the leaders' declaration, while Prime Minister Hashimoto tries to plug the microphone of the summit into this plug hole with a variety of different Asian issues written there: Indonesia, Japan, and India. So Japan has ensured that Asia has a voice within the G7. At the same time, Japan has made an intellectual contribution to the G7's evolving agenda. If we go back to 1975 and the first summit in Rambouillet, in the outskirts of Paris, you can see that Japanese proposals shaped a lot of that first Rambouillet declaration. Now, this is important because the G7 does not have membership criteria. So often we will go back to that declaration to see how the leaders constructed informal leadership criteria. And Article 2, Article 12 were all shaped by Japanese proposals at that time. So it's made a contribution through having Asia represented, it's made a contribution intellectually. And then fast forward to the 2000 summit in Okinawa, you can see that Japan's intellectual sort of signature policy of human security formed one of the pillars of the Okinawa summit as well. So Japan may not be as vocal in terms of the contribution it's made to the G7 agenda, but it clearly has shaped the G7 agenda. Secondly, financial support. Possibly less salient today, but Japan has traditionally provided substantial financial support to progress many of the G7's initiatives. Now, this is a natural outcome of Japan's traditional post-war emphasis on using the economic tools of foreign policy. But it's also wrapped up within specific tactics like gift-bearing diplomacy, turning up at the summit with a financial initiative, a financial contribution that can be presented to the leaders. Again, I have a political cartoon which captures this, and this is from the 1988 Toronto summit, and makes light of Prime Minister Takeshita visiting the summit, but announcing a 5-year plan to double Japan's ODA contributions to over 6 trillion yen, making Japan in the process the second largest ODA contributor to the world, and demonstrating its concrete international contributions through financial aid. You can see here he is balancing a wad of yen in performing for the G7 leaders, if you like. Thirdly, hosting. Whenever Japan has hosted a summit, it's always tried to ensure that it's going to be a successful summit. More so, it could be argued, than most other G7 countries. Now, the G7 Research Group, in its work is not only involving being at the summits and providing compliance reports, it has also graded each of the summits using another methodology. And if you look at the consistency in those gradings, you'll see that Japan receives the most consistent grades for hosting successful summits. Not only does it always try to ensure a successful summit, it has also tried to innovate in the way that the G7 is organized. And one example, I could cite many, but one example would be in 2000 at the Okinawa summit, when the first NGO center was established. Now, I'm not going to suggest that this was a perfect solution, but it did set a precedent that was followed by other hosts in terms of civil society engagement with the G7. Legitimacy. Having Japan around the summit table provides the G7 with a bit more legitimacy. It has a legitimacy problem, being predominantly North American and European leaders around the table. But Japan's presence goes some way, doesn't solve, but goes some way to addressing that legitimacy issue. And the final aspect I'll mention, the way in which Japan matters to the G7, is in terms of cohesion. So Japan has sought throughout the summit history to play the role of a bridge between European and North American leaders over a wide variety of possibly divisive issues. I gave you that image at the very beginning, which shows Prime Minister Abe in the center as a bridge between Europe and North America. But this was similar in the 1980s. We've already heard mention of divides within the G7 during the 1980s between Reagan and Mitterrand. It was Japan that sort of sought to act as a go-between and ensure dialogue between the two sides. Another summit watcher, Nicholas Bain at the London School of Economics, has used phrases around the G7 hanging together as a group because of its cohesion. Japan has contributed towards that cohesion over the history of the summit. And I think probably Russia's inclusion demonstrates the concerns that Japan had about possibly disrupting that cohesion by bringing Japan into the group and forming a G8. Japan, at the time during the 1990s, was the most vocal opponent of including Russia within an expanded group. Right, so let me flip round the question and say, how does the G7 matter to Japan in the time I've got left? And I've got no idea how long that is left, so I'm looking to Tomoko to tell me to stop talking at whatever point. Thank you. So how does the G7 matter to Japan in terms of Japan's foreign policy? I think three aspects I would mention here. First of all, identity. Now, I am, by confession, on the constructivist end of international relations theories. So I tend to look at identities. And I think that Japan, well, the G7 has mattered to Japan in helping it reinforce its status as a contemporary great power. By inviting Japan, by inviting Prime Minister Miki to the very first summit in Rambouillet in November 1975, Japan was recognized as a great power of the day. This inclusive approach stood in contrast to other mechanisms of global governance which didn't extend that recognition to Japan. So there's that identity that the G7 reinforces for Japan. At the same time, and I've already alluded to this, it reinforces Japan's identity as the representative of Asia, Asia no Daihyo. And Japan has responded to that by putting 1 minute left, oh dear, by putting a range of issues onto the agenda, which we can maybe talk about in the Q&A. I think another important aspect for Japan is managing the USA. Japan has gone out of its way to try and use the summit in order to manage the most important bilateral relationship in the world, bar none, as we used to refer to the Japan-US alliance. And this is a cartoon from the 1983 Williamsburg summit, where you can see Prime Minister Nakasone acting as the catcher and President Reagan acting as the pitcher. And these were the sort of the close interpersonal relationship between the two that developed, the Ron-Yasu relationship that came out of this summit and the roles that they accorded to each other. So Japan over time has always used the summit as an opportunity to try and manage the US-Japan relationship. It has also provided Japan with an opportunity to pursue national interests. I'm being told to stop right now, but I'm going to blatantly ignore that and just carry on for 1 minute. I do apologize. Japan has used its the summit to pursue a range of issues that you might not expect to see on the G7 agenda. So issues such as the Northern Territories dispute with Russia has appeared on the agenda. And again, I have a cartoon. I'm going to keep on going because I want to show you these cartoons, which are great. This is from the time of the 1993 Tokyo summit, and you can see there, well, the other leaders are sort of trying to support Gorbachev. You can see that Prime Minister Kaifu is there, possibly disrupting the situation by bringing into play the issue around the territorial dispute with Russia. Similarly with the Rachijiken, the issue of Japanese citizens kidnapped by North Korean agents. You can see that has appeared on a G7 agenda, which you would not expect to see on a multilateral agenda. So very quickly, because I'm way over time now, in terms of how this matters for the Japanese Prime Minister, not just Japanese foreign policy, but the Japanese Prime Minister, leaders often try and use the summit for their own domestic purposes, often with elections in mind. However, there's no proof to show that a G7 or a G20 summit has actually played to the advantage of a leader in terms of getting re-elected. But this cartoon from, again, the 1993 Tokyo summit shows how Prime Minister Miyazawa was seeking to do that. For the non-Japanese speakers in the audience, this is Prime Minister Miyazawa serving katsudon to the other leaders. Katsudon is a meal that you would often eat before exams in Japan because it has the word katsu in it, which means to win. And here is sort of Miyazawa trying to use it to get support for upcoming elections in 1993. Finally, just in terms of Japanese society, the arrival of the G7 and the world's media to a city in Japan will provide an opportunity to showcase local culture, local traditions, local history, as well as issues in the area. So 2000, we saw that with Okinawa. You saw a human chain of over 27,000 protesters around the US base in Kadena. 2008, the Toyako Summit provided an opportunity to showcase the history and the culture of the Ainu people. I would expect to see something similar around Hiroshima. And finally, the G7 Summit is an opportunity to celebrate. Diplomatic mega events can often get confused as being like the Olympic Games or like the World Cup. I think former Minister of Foreign Affairs Tanaka Makiko is quoted as saying, "Isn't this mistaking the summit for a world fair?" But you can see that around the summit, you'll see initiatives like the publishing of new stamps, new banknotes. We had a new 2,000 yen note in Japan because of the 2000 Okinawa summit. You can see the release of theme songs. Accredited journalists will be given press passes to visit Japan and soak up the culture. I would expect to see something very similar in Hiroshima. Now, I realise I've spoken for too long. I hope you enjoyed the cartoons. I also realise that I provided a very sort of rose-tinted, slightly Pollyanna-ish view of the G7 and Japan's role therein. There's a lot of complicating factors, obviously. I've managed to talk without actually mentioning the word Ukraine once. There are also a number of challenges for Japan within the G7 around leadership in an informal setting like the G7. So I think with that, it would be a seamless link if I was to hand over to Stephen to complicate matters a little bit.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Dobson, for this enlightening presentation. Now, our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the International Christian University.
Thank you very much, Hugo. And again, let me also express my congratulations to Soka University for their performance on the higher education ranking system, but also for hosting this very timely discussion. I think looking at what's happening with the G7, looking at the convergences, as well as some of the divergences of the G7 members, it's a very important discussion to have. In terms of my comments today, I'd like to break down the structure of my discussion into four particular parts. First is looking at leadership and agenda setting in terms of the context of, what does the G7 mean for Japan, but what does Japan mean for the G7? Second, and importantly, I'd like to talk about selective multilateralism. And you may not like this, but I think selective multilateralism is the direction that we're moving forward in terms of how we think about global cooperation. Third is the convergences and divergences within the G7, which I think is important to touch upon. And again, Hugo set the foundation for this discussion. And lastly, and I apologize for the interpreters if not in my notes, the Japan-US relationship. And I think it is very critical for us to be always considering the Japan-US relationship and how it engages in its policies moving forward. In terms of that first area, leadership and agenda setting is a really critical part of the host's role in terms of the G7. And that is a platform for agenda setting at the domestic, regional, and international level. The G7 provides the host country the opportunity to highlight themes it feels important for fellow G7 members to be thinking about. And with Prime Minister Kishida Fumio at the head of this year's summit in Hiroshima, of course, his identity, where he comes from, and Hiroshima's experience as being the first city that experienced the atomic bomb will be at the centerpiece of his agenda. Again, highlighting the dangers of weapons of mass destruction, proliferation by North Korea, but also thinking about the broader trend in the international community with great powers really issuing or giving up the idea of denuclearization and expanding their nuclear weapons as a means of defense. In particular, I'm thinking here, of course, Russia just this past week, Mr. Putin talked about placing tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus as a response to what he understands as NATO NATO expansion and a war against Russia. But we also have China committing to the expansion of 1,500 nuclear missiles in China by 2035. This is significant. And of course, the context here is deterrence of the United States. But for countries like Japan, at the leading edge of, I think, the most dynamic and perhaps the most dangerous part of the world, they're looking at these dynamics very seriously. I would be remiss not to add that discussions in South Korea are also moving towards the acquisition of a nuclear deterrent against North Korea. These have serious repercussions for how Japan is thinking about security, and this is why I think denuclearization and weapons of mass destruction are really a centerpiece of the agenda of this year's G7. But we should put this in the context of the layered discussion that I mentioned in terms of domestic, regional, and international dynamics. And importantly, I think we should be thinking about how Japan has been quite consistent in terms of denuclearization. Whether it's the 2022 June Shangri-La dialogue, where Prime Minister Kishida, in his Vision for Peace, spoke specifically about a commitment towards denuclearization, or most recently, the release of the new national security strategy stresses that Japan is not moving away from its 3 non-nuclear principles. Again, the G7 role, promoting denuclearization, really is not just for the G7. It's part of a longer-term strategy that I think Japan continues to be vested in. I would like to also add that I think Japan is also very much interested in shaping other dynamics. And again, if we look at the guest list on the G7 level, and we didn't mention this morning, expansion of the G7, but where does South Korea play in this G7? What about Australia? And what about India? These are important economies. India, of course, will be most likely the 4th largest economy or the 3rd largest economy within the next decade. South Korea plays an important part in supply chains, but also, as we saw with the UN Kishida summit just last week, that these countries with proper synergy have a huge amount of ability to provide public goods, either bilaterally, trilaterally within the US, Japan, South Korea context, or potentially as part of the United Nations. And here again, I think Japan advocating for them coming to the summit really plays an important role in thinking about where is the direction of the G7, where are the key players that Japan should be focused, or Japan and the G7 countries should be focusing on. I would be, again, remiss not to focus on the Pacific Islands. And you've probably noticed in the invitation list, we have some Pacific Island countries that are also being welcomed to the G7. And this reflects, I think, Japan's underlying assumptions of the region that we need to bring in other stakeholders into the G7 to help shape its agenda. And this agenda, of course, is environmental and dealing environmental issues and dealing with environmental climate change, dealing with resilience issues, which have become much more pronounced in the COVID-19 pandemic, but also, again, as our keynote speech mentioned this morning, talking about how the invasion of Ukraine has affected supply chains, food security, and other supply chains. And again, economic security is a key part of that. Now, let me drift towards this idea of selective multilateralism. And I think that this is really a really important theme that the G7 is going to have to address. There is increasing tension between multilateralism as exemplified by the G7, the G20, ASEAN, and even the EU, as certain countries are proactively trying to weaken these international institutions and have a track record of fracturing their cooperation. And as a result, we're seeing many-lateral cooperation emerge, whether it's the Quad, whether it's AUKUS, or whether it's trade agreements that are very focused, such as the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Clearly, multilateral cooperation is important to deal with climate change, denuclearization, dealing with the post-pandemic recovery of the global economy. But at the same time, we need to be realistic about the challenges for large-scale multilateralism and how they can be negatively affected by states that clearly have an interest in weakening rule of law, weakening international institutions, and sometimes, as they say, democratizing the international system. And this raises very serious questions of what is the direction of the G7? Who do they bring into the G7 in terms of cooperation? And how do they think about multilateral versus minilateral cooperation. I would like to add that the G7 is really interesting because I think that it's a venue to provide cover for countries like Japan as they're trying to deliver very strong messages to regional disruptors. By way of example, I think that the national security law in Hong Kong is a very good example. Japan used the cover of the G7 to have a joint communique which criticized the national security law. And we've seen similar trends with regards to the military exercises around Taiwan in August 2023, but also the invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the arbitrary detention of Canadians following the arrest of the Huawei executive. The G7 does provide a very useful tool for Japan to express itself without directly expressing its criticisms to particular states. And I think this will continue to be a useful tool. And this is not a particularly Japanese phenomenon, but I think it's an interesting aspect of how the G7 is instrumentalized by Japan. In terms of convergences, I think broadly at the security and economic level, there's a lot of convergences in how Japan and the other G7 countries are seeing international challenges. As evidence, we look at the EU, Canada, Germany, as well as other states have adopted Indo-Pacific strategies or guidelines or visions. And each of these really interestingly talk about a rules-based order. They talked about the importance of economic resilience. They talk about environmental change, and they talk about trying to ensure that rules-based processes, how we negotiate trade, how we negotiate international disputes, and how we manage the maritime domain. And again, this suggests that Japan's role, and Japan has been on the forefront of preaching these areas at least for 10 years, if not longer, shows that Japan has had a role in, I guess, educating other G7s as to members as to the importance of these particular issues. Again, broad convergence on the areas of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and again, this implications for a rules-based order moving forward. This theme is permeating the G7 members as authoritarian states continue to try and rewrite the software of the international rules-based order. And I think that's an important take-home for us to be thinking about. How do we manage states that are trying to rewrite the international system? And is the G7 an effective tool to be able to ensure that that software remains the same, or it's updated in a way that reflects our interests? Notwithstanding the convergences, I think, that exist on security and economic issues, I think that we should be realistic that there are divergences on important areas that may not have macro consequences, but here I'm talking about cultural issues, human rights issues, rule of law issues. And again, Madeleine's presentation this morning talked about how well different states have managed in terms of their promises. And this comes out in their behavior and policy choices and budgets. Here, I think there is divergence in terms of where Japan is sitting on cultural issues, some human rights issues, and some rule of law issues. And this is an area that I think more work needs to be done in terms of convergences. Lastly is the United States. And yes, the United States is a critical country for this country's future, but I would argue all the other G7 countries' future. And as we saw under the previous president of the United States, we had challenges in terms of being on the same page of the book about many different issues. The reality moving forward in the 2024 elections is that we may have another disruptor in the White House, or we may not. How do G7 countries manage the United States moving forward is a very important question. Do we continue to find crosswalks of cooperation where the United States can take a leadership position in a way that meets our interests? Or do we act as a collective bloc to try and influence, lobby, and push it in a different direction? Of course, this will depend on who is in the White House in 2024, but the G7 members, including Japan, have an important role in trying to ensure that the United States makes choices that are not only in the interests of the United States, but in the interests of the G7 members. We saw Japan played a special role during the Trump administration in trying to push back against some of the less less orthodox approaches by the United States to manage challenges. But I think that we need to be very conscious that Japan needs to work with the other G7 members, again, to ensure that the G7 functions in areas and ways that benefit its members, benefit the global community, not just by influencing the United States, but by bringing in other stakeholders such as South Korea, India, Australia, and Pacific Island members. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagy, for this insightful presentation. Okay, thank you so much. So now we will move to Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share.
Good morning. Hello, my name is Brenda. I come from Bolivia, and I am working here at Japan at the SGI headquarters. Thank you so much for your amazing lecture. My question goes for any of you. I would like to know what role or strategies is Japan and the rest of the G7 countries doing for helping the development countries, and what these development countries mean to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Brenda. It's great to see that we have more international students here in Japan learning about Japan, but also I assume you're teaching a lot about your own country. So that's really wonderful. Your question is, what is the role or strategy of Japan and other G7 members in helping developing countries and understanding developing countries? So here I think that we can look at this, again, through the lens of the G7, but also minilateral cooperation, and then what Japan has been doing over the long term. So let's take a look at the G7, and I think the Build Back Better proposal that was put forward by the G7 members last year, was it last year in the UK? Suggests that they have an understanding of the importance of infrastructure and connectivity as key elements to build developmental foundations moving forward. How much has this been translated into reality is a different question at the global level. But when we shift to the minilateral level, and I think this is important for you to be looking at, Japan works with various different formulas to provide infrastructure and connectivity funding, financing, as well as the tools to build that infrastructure connectivity. And the real basis is, the view is that from, I think, the perspective of Japan and the partnering countries, is that countries that have infrastructure and connectivity can open up their markets, they can open up the flow of labor, they can open up the flow of capital, which has a virtuous cycle in terms of development. It does this through, again, the Japan, Australia, and India have a resilient supply chain initiative, which is meant to try and build infrastructure connectivity in Southeast Asia. It does this through ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, to build infrastructure. So Prime Minister Kishida, again, pledged more money to India last week when he visited Mr. Modi. And again, the view is to start to build up the economy so that they can be self-sustaining and create more labor movement and capital. So lots of different formulas, and this is meant to build more strategic autonomy, to help these societies create capital so that they can reinvest in education and other critical parts of the economy that are understood as being important for a virtuous cycle moving forward.
Thanks for that, Stephen, and thank you for the question, Brenda. One aspect you asked was, what does the term developing countries mean to us? I think as a label, one thing we probably learned from the 2008 global financial crisis is that we're all developing countries now, in a sense. You know, the label has lost its sort of distinction between, you know, its bipolar distinction between two sets. So I think, yeah, we're all global developing countries now. Stephen highlighted the sort of G7's leadership on infrastructure projects, beginning at Cornwall Summit 2 years ago, but then getting a launch last year in Bavaria. And I think this is sort of one area which is certainly worth attention. And I think one emphasis I would highlight is the way high quality infrastructure is always stressed as part of that initiative. Now, I'd like to hear definitely more Japanese voices and what Japan feels around this, but my sense is that when the phrase high quality is introduced, it's a thinly veiled criticism of Chinese infrastructure projects, most notably Belt and Road Initiative. So again, we can see a multilateral or a minilateral project undercut by national interest or national rivalries as well. But this is maybe something, I don't know, Japanese people in the audience will be able to comment on. But thank you for the question, Brenda. Does that go any way close to answering it?
Yeah, totally. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And also, if anyone online has a question, okay.
I'll be reading out the question from the online participants. So there is a question saying, how can the G7 adapt to country leaders that don't have an interest in pursuing the G7 interests?
Okay, if I kick off on this one and then maybe hand over to Stephen. So I think if we take the Trump years out of the equation, which are an extreme example and probably not representative, you know, what we can see previously in the history of the G7 is any G7 cynics or doubters getting socialized within the way in which the G7 does business. You know, I think you can see a number of ways in which the G7 provides a forum for consensus. It's not a forum in which people will walk out or decisions and final declarations won't be decided. Now, that does characterize the Trump years, but as I said, that would be an extreme example. I think for the most part, the G7 have used it as a way to socialize new leaders into their way of doing business. And John talked about Washington Consensus and so on, you know, and these are all sort of form concrete positions, but also norms by which members are doing business within the G7. So, yeah, I think history, if we're going to use history as a yardstick, tells us that the G7 can be used as a mechanism to socialize leaders. Stephen?
Yeah, I think that one of the unique aspects of the G7 is there's an agenda that has many issues, and the plethora of issues allows for agreement. You don't have to agree on all the issues. You can agree on, for example, economic security or resilience or dealing with climate change or vaccine cooperation. And this provides an element where any leader can come in and take a political win when they come back home and say, listen, I don't agree with any other aspect of the G7, but I can come home and say that I agreed to boosting vaccine production because it's in the interests of, let's say, Canada. So I think that this is the genius of the formula, is that you don't need to agree with everything to find some kind of way to participate positively and bring back political capital. And I think this is maybe the genius of the institutional design.
Okay, thank you so much. So it's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Minoru Koide from Soka University. I'm interested in how would the rise of China influence Japan's role in G7 group. On one end, China's rise overshadowed the Japanese status in Asia, which used to be the #1 economic power, but today it's far behind #2 economic power in Asia. But at the same time, the rise of China is making G7 increasingly important as a group of liberal democracy. So overall, how does the rise of China influence Japan's role in G7? That's my question.
Thank you so much for that question. So again, my mind is casting its way back through the history of G7 summits, and I'm trying to think of times when Japan has deliberately tried to engage with China within the format of the G7. And I think going back to Tiananmen, you can see a very clear case where Japan tried to use the G7 as a format to ensure that leaders were re-engaging with China after a period of introducing sanctions against China in reaction to the Tiananmen incident. And then fast forward to 2000, you can literally hear my mind going through the years trying to find these examples. But the Okinawa summit, Japan, in the early stages of preparation, did seek to invite China to Okinawa, as it had done with Indonesia in 1993, and it tried with Australia in 1978, I think. Sorry, 1979. So you can see on the one hand engagement. I think on the other hand, you can see attempts to try and shore up the cohesion of the G7 as a group by highlighting what makes it a group in contradistinction to China. So under Prime Minister Abe, I mean, I can remember being at the first Schloss Elmau summit in 2015 at Prime Minister Abe's press conference. And what you saw was a very clear attempt to stress what binds the G7 together, the rule of law, democracy, etc. This is all stands in contradistinction to China. And I think people have touted the idea of an Abe doctrine in foreign policy. And I think this was sort of one way in which you could see the G7 being used to try and promote a clearer sort of Abe doctrine that broke with the past of the Yoshida doctrine. So I think on the one hand there is engagement, but on the other hand there is an attempt to shore up the legitimacy, well, the cohesion of the G7 and ensure that it's cohesive, but it stands as a group in relation to China.
So Professor Koide, thank you very much for the question. I think a good place to start here is to look at some regional surveys. The Institute of Southeast Asian Studies has a survey called the Survey of Southeast Asia. And year after year, Japan is seen as the most trusted country in Southeast Asia, followed by the EU. And China is quite at the bottom of that list. The United States is slightly above. Under the Biden administration, the US trust has increased in this survey. The Asia Power Index out of the Lowy Institute is also an excellent tool to chart how Japan's soft power and its diplomatic influence and networks has positioned Japan well in the region. So I use these two tools to I guess communicate the fact that Japan has played a poker hand that's pretty weak very well. And it's weak because its economy is shrinking. It's small compared to China's economic influence within the region, but it's using its resources very, very well. So that suggests that your question, how does China influence Japan's role in the G7 in Asia? Its behavior is influencing it in a way that boosts Japan's reputation, gives it more legitimacy. I want to link this to this view about leadership, and I mentioned leadership and agenda setting in my initial comments about the G7. Whether you liked Mr. Abe or not, his leadership was really welcomed in much of the world, in the G7, in ASEAN, in South Asia. And his leadership, again, resulted in trade agreements, resulted in economic partnerships, resulted in many positive initiatives that were welcomed in this region. I think that we've lost the momentum under the past two prime ministers, although I do see a bit of light at the end of the tunnel with the current prime minister. So leadership matters, and how Japan presents itself within the G7, how Japan presents itself as a trade leader within the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or the Japan-EU Economic Partnership Agreement, or within the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership really matters. So merely looking at how China influences Japan's role in the G7 in Asia through the G7 maybe is not the best way to be thinking about how we can understand Japan's position within the region. It should be engagement in many different multilateral and minilateral institutions that focus on rules, that focus on trade, that focuses on inclusivity. And here again, I think that China's behavior has actually positioned Japan quite well. The question moving forward is how well will Japan play its hand? And this requires leadership, openness, and good partners.
Thank you so much. We still have time for questions online.
We have another question from an online participant. It says, will G7 also take up NATO's role in terms of redefining it, given Russia's aggressive reactions against Ukraine?
So NATO is an Atlantic-centered organization, and I think that is very clear. Many of the NATO members in Central and Eastern Europe want NATO's resources to be on the Eastern Front to concentrate on dealing with the challenge of Russia's aggression towards the Ukraine. But that being said, the Madrid summit in June 2022, which welcomed Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, shows that there's solidarity at the normative level and recognizing the challenge that Russia's invasion of the Ukraine means for the EU, but also global order. So again, I would like to really emphasize that. NATO is an Atlantic-centered organization. I don't see the possibility of an Asian NATO emerging anytime soon. The region's too heterogeneous, and probably a better way to deal with the challenges within the region goes back to that delicate balance between which multilateral organization is functional for Japan and to provide some security and economic weight in the region, and which minilateral organizations can deal with the real challenges within the region. I think that is probably the way to be looking at how to manage the challenges within this region moving forward.
And just to piggyback on that, I think obviously we need to be careful here in maintaining our understanding of these different organizations. So as Stephen says, NATO has a geographical focus. It's also a formal, legalistic, multilateral organization with a charter and a headquarters and so on. The G7 has none of these. The G7 is an informal grouping. So if we think of one as maybe the hardware of global governance or regional governance, and the G7 is providing the software, where what it can do is provide the sort of the nudging strategies that might lead to delegation to a formal organisation or the creation of a new organisation. That's probably where the G7's best positioned to lead, in distinction against more formal mechanisms.
Can I just add? So I think we often, our reflex reaction is to look at security challenges through the lens of NATO or other security arrangements, rather than thinking about the economy and coordinated financial policy, and thinking about how coordination amongst countries can have an important deterrent effect against adversaries. I think when we look at the United Nations, the EU and the United States and Japan and Australia and other countries' coordination against Russia's invasion, the primary tools have been economic, and they continue to be economic. We talked a little bit about the global south today. Let's talk about the global north. 25% of the population, 80% of the global GDP. G7 members, as well as the global north, have an immense amount of resources that they can throw at challenges. And that means financial tools, trade agreements, regulatory processes, and domestic legislation that can have non-military effects in terms of mitigating some of the security challenges that we look at. So while I recognize security is important and NATO is important, I think we should be looking at how the G7 can use the convergences of its financial institutions and economic interests and broader international network and economic weight to deal with the challenges that exist in this region or in the Europe.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one last question. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your great presentation, Professor Dobson and Nagy. My name is Hayato Yamashita, and I'm working for the Office of Peace and Global Issues of Soka Gakkai headquarters. And I'd like to ask a questions regarding like how does G7 summit matters to Japan, but more specifically, how does the G7 summit matters to the Kishida cabinet? The government has been, as you know, experiencing the reduction of support from public based on the public survey these days. But recently, it's been slightly rising since Prime Minister visited G7 countries, including even Ukraine, to get supports from them. And we should note that Mr. Kishida's term as a head of LDP will be terminated by the next year, and the national election of House of Representatives is likely to take place by then. Currently, there's a discussion of when the election will take place, so the success of the G7 summit is critical for him to win the election. Having said this, in your opinion, how do you see the success of the G7 summit in Hiroshima, and what would be critical for what would be a criteria for us like citizens to judge whether the G7 summit is success or fail? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that question. I'm going to quote a journalist at the time of the 2009 London G20 summit who looked at Gordon Brown, who again was in a situation where he was wondering whether to call an election or not, and commented that there are no votes in summits. And I do tend to agree with that. Having looked back over the history of G7 summits and tried to look at opinion polls and how they were tracking before the summit, during the summit, and after the summit, it's very, very difficult to see any correlation or definitely no causation between the summit and a successful boon in approval ratings or an electoral victory. So I think it's natural to try and draw the two together and seek out a link, but I think the evidence suggests that there is no link between the two. That does not stop leaders from trying to pursue it, though.
All politics are local. And that's basically what you said. I'm paraphrasing. So I think it's really important for us to be thinking about what matters for the ordinary Tanaka and Suzuki. Wages are up, right? We have increases in wages, full employment for young people. These are the primary barometers of the voters in terms of how they think about where the LDP is and the position and the strength of political leaders. I would add that if the US-Japan alliance was in a much weaker position or perceived by the ordinary Japanese as in danger, this would be potentially an area of concern for leadership change, but I don't see any change, rather a strengthening of that relationship. So again, going back to what Hugo's comment is that really there's no votes in the summit. It's all local politics. The question is I guess moving forward is, what is the direction of the Kishida government, and will it be able to fulfill this so-called new capitalism? Will it be able to deal with inflation, which is still going to be with us? This is a structural issue. And how will it be able to allay the concerns of ordinary citizens about the direction of the economy moving forward? And I don't think Mr. Kishida has the answer. But again, I think that the ordinary voters focus on stability at home rather than these fancy summits.
Okay, thank you so much for great questions. And also, again, thank you very much to Professor Dobson and Dr. Nagy for great presentations. So now this concludes the panel session. I hope you're going to enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you to the speakers and to the chair.